If you're enjoying these forgotten cases, please like the video and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what's the weather like there right now? In the summer of 1863, Medina, Ohio was the kind of town where people still measured trust by familiarity. Livestock dealers knew the farmers they traded with. Store owners extended credit on reputation. Families left their doors unlocked during the day. Even with the Civil War reshaping the country beyond Ohio's borders, Medina remained a place built on routines that seemed permanent. The town sat along important roads linking Cleveland to the agricultural communities farther south and west. Wagons carrying livestock moved steadily through Medina County. Farmers discussed crop prices outside feed stores. Young men enlisted for the Union Army while newspapers carried casualty lists from battles hundreds of miles away. One of the better-known residents in the area was Shubal Coy. Coy was 40 years old, a livestock dealer with a practical reputation and a stable income. He was not wealthy in the way bankers or industrialists were wealthy, but in rural Ohio, cash on hand mattered more than appearances. Men like Coy operated largely through direct transactions. A successful purchase of cattle or sheep could involve hundreds of dollars changing hands in a single day. He lived with his wife and their 7-year-old son Ferdinand in a modest home outside the centre of Medina. Contemporary accounts describe the family as respectable and well-liked. Their home was part residence and part working household, the kind of place where neighbours came and went comfortably. On July 1st, 1863, Shubal Coy cashed a cheque for approximately $1,200. He intended to use the money to purchase sheep. According to people who knew him, Coy often kept large sums close at hand and was known to sleep with money under his pillow. That detail would later become central to the investigation. The same summer, another figure had attracted attention in Medina. A man calling himself Captain Frederick F had arrived in town claiming to be an officer connected to the 64th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Streeter presented himself as a military recruiter at a time when Civil War uniforms still carried prestige and authority, but the reality behind the title was less impressive. Frederick Streeter had originally enlisted in Berdan's sharpshooters, serving with Vermont's 1st Regiment. Records show that he never rose beyond the rank of corporal. Reports from the period indicate that he deserted and returned to Bellows Falls, Vermont. There were also troubling allegations attached to his past. Newspapers later claimed that before leaving Vermont, Streeter had attempted to set fire to his own home while his wife and child were inside. The accusation was never fully adjudicated in court, but it followed him west. By 1863, Streeter was living beyond his means in Medina. His recruiting venture had failed. He had little visible income, yet he dressed carefully and cultivated the appearance of importance. He also married into a respected local family. His new wife, 16-year-old Miss Whitmore, came from a prominent Medina household. Through her, Streeter gained access to local society. Mrs. Streeter was reportedly close friends with Mrs. Coy and had visited the Coy home frequently. That connection gave Frederick Streeter something far more valuable than social standing. It gave him familiarity with the Coy household. At approximately 3:30 on the morning of July 2nd, 1863, a young man travelling to work noticed flames coming from the Coy residence. He raised the alarm immediately. Neighbours rushed toward the property carrying buckets of water. The fire had begun spreading through portions of the house, but it had not yet fully consumed the structure. Once the flames were partially controlled, several men entered the home expecting to rescue the family. Instead, they found a massacre. Shubal Coy was discovered in bed with multiple stab wounds to the throat and chest. Contemporary medical descriptions recorded 9 separate wounds, any one of which could have been fatal. Mrs. Coy lay nearby on the floor. Unlike her husband, evidence suggested she had awakened and resisted the attack. She suffered extensive cuts to her body and head, more than 20 wounds according to reports at the time. Her throat had also been slashed. Their young son Ferdinand remained in bed. His throat had been cut while he slept. The scene immediately suggested more than simple robbery. The violence was controlled, deliberate and methodical. Yet one clear motive emerged quickly. The money was gone. Investigators learned within hours that Coy had recently cashed a substantial check. The envelope that had apparently contained the money was later discovered outside the house. Blood appeared along the torn edge. The killer had also attempted to destroy the evidence. Authorities concluded that the fire had likely been set after the murders in an effort to burn the house before the crime could be discovered. Had neighbours arrived 15 minutes later, the bodies and physical evidence might have been consumed entirely. The investigation began almost immediately. At first, there was confusion surrounding bloody handprints discovered near a fence outside the property. Some feared the markings indicated multiple attackers, but investigators later determined the prints belonged to neighbours who had moved the victims and wiped blood from their hands. Authorities also recovered a large butcher knife belonging to the Coy household. The blade had reportedly been cleaned, but investigators believed it was likely the murder weapon. The attempted fire revealed additional planning. Investigators concluded the killer had piled clothing, bedding, and paper beneath portions of the house and set them alight after the murders. But because the home had been tightly shut during the night, the flames lacked sufficient oxygen and smouldered slowly instead of spreading rapidly. That failure preserved the crime scene. Had the fire drawn more air through open windows or doors, the structure may have burned completely before neighbours arrived. Inside the house, little additional physical evidence remained. The killer appeared to have entered while the family was away visiting friends earlier that evening. Neighbours believed the attacker concealed himself inside the house, waited until the family slept, then carried out the murders during the early morning hours. The brutality of the crime stunned Medina. This was not an anonymous killing in a distant city. Entire families knew the victims personally. Ferdinand Coy's death especially intensified public anger. Within days, county commissioners announced a reward for information leading to an arrest. Eventually, the reward climbed to $4,000, an extraordinary amount for the time. Attention soon turned toward Frederick F. Streeter. The suspicions surrounding Streeter were built less on a single dramatic revelation and more on a series of practical observations. Before the murders, he had been in debt. After the murders, he suddenly had money. Witnesses reported that Streeter began paying off obligations almost immediately. He purchased new clothing. He spent freely around Medina. He also claimed to have won a large amount gambling in Cleveland during the same period as the murders. The explanation raised doubts. His timeline was inconsistent. Accounts of when he travelled and how much money he carried shifted during questioning. Meanwhile, investigators examined his connection to the Coy family. Because his wife frequently visited Mrs. Coy, Streeter had likely learned details about the household, including the fact that Shubal Coy kept cash in the home. As suspicion intensified, Streeter and his wife abruptly left Medina and travelled west. That departure transformed concern into pursuit. Medina prosecutor S.B. Woodward joined Detective Burleson of Akron in tracking the couple across several states. Their movements created a paper trail through hotels and rail lines. The Streeters stayed in Woodstock, Illinois with relatives. They travelled through Milwaukee, Chicago, and Springfield, reportedly lodging at expensive hotels despite Streeter's earlier financial troubles. Eventually they reached Kenosha, Wisconsin. There, authorities learned the couple had purchased tickets to Boston. Woodward and Burleson intercepted them before departure. Accounts from the arrest described Streeter as calm. He denied involvement in the murders, but reportedly offered little resistance when taken back to Medina. The most damaging evidence emerged after the arrest. Authorities found $64 in greenbacks in Streeter's possession, including two $20 bills with blood visible along their edges. Investigators compared the stains to the bloody marks left on the torn envelope discovered outside the Coy home. According to prosecutors, the blood patterns matched precisely. Combined with Streeter's inconsistent explanations and his sudden access to money, the bills became the centerpiece of the state's case. Newspapers seized on the story. Descriptions of Streeter in the press were harsh and highly personal. One publication portrayed him as vain, theatrical, and unaccustomed to honest labour. Such descriptions reflected not only suspicion about the murders, but broader anxieties surrounding transient men during the Civil War era. particularly individuals who adopted military titles without distinction. One claim also began circulating quietly around Medina. According to later local histories, a jail guard allegedly heard Streeter whisper the words, "I did it," but they can't prove it. The statement never appeared as formal testimony during trial proceedings, and no signed confession was ever produced. Historians have continued to treat the account cautiously because it survives largely through later retellings rather than official court documentation. Still, the alleged remark became part of the case's enduring folklore. By late 1863, Frederick F. Streeter stood formally charged with first-degree murder. The trial began in Medina during December 1863. Public interest was overwhelming. Courtrooms in 19th century America often functioned as both legal proceedings and public spectacles, and the Streeter trial became exactly that. Reports described the room packed beyond capacity. At one point, the floor partially gave way beneath the crowd gathered to witness testimony. The prosecution built its case around circumstantial evidence. No eyewitness placed Streeter inside the Coy house during the murders. No murder weapon definitively tied him to the killings. Instead, prosecutors argued that the sequence of facts formed a coherent chain. Streeter knew the family. He knew about the money. He had debts before the murders and unexplained funds afterward. He fled town. And most importantly, he possessed bills allegedly stained with blood corresponding to the envelope recovered outside the scene. The defense challenged these conclusions. Streeter continued insisting he had obtained the money through gambling while in Cleveland. Defense counsel also questioned whether the blood evidence conclusively proved anything beyond coincidence. But the prosecution's narrative aligned closely with public opinion. The murders had been especially horrifying because they appeared motivated by ordinary greed. There was no political motive, no drunken altercation, no sudden quarrel. Prosecutors described the killings as calculated and opportunistic. Throughout the proceedings, observers repeatedly commented on Streeter's composure. Reports stated he sat through testimony with unusual calmness, showing little visible emotion. After deliberating for approximately 10 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. Judge Burke then formally addressed the prisoner. When asked whether he had anything to say before sentencing, Streeter answered, "My counsel have done all for me that could be done, yet I protest I am an innocent man and time, I think, will develop it." The judge reviewed the severity of the crime before imposing sentence. While discussing the murder of young Ferdinand Coy, witnesses reported that Streeter visibly weakened, trembling and sinking into his chair. Judge Burke sentenced him to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for February 26, 1864. But the case was not yet finished. While confined in the Medina County Jail, Streeter attempted escape repeatedly. At some point, tools were reportedly passed through his cell window. He began digging through portions of the jail structure, eventually creating an opening into an adjoining vacant cell. On Christmas Eve 1863, he escaped. According to reports, Streeter waited for an opportunity while the jailer's son entered the hall to tend a stove fire. When the boy inadvertently left a door unsecured, Streeter slipped away unnoticed. He hid inside the building until darkness, then jumped from an upper-story window. Before leaving Medina, he reportedly stopped at his father-in-law's home and slipped a note beneath the door addressed to his wife. The escape triggered outrage across Ohio. Newspapers referred to him as a demon in human shape. Rewards increased. A statewide search began immediately. The manhunt lasted only days. On December 30, authorities captured Streeter hiding in a barn near Richfield, Ohio, at the property of a relative. This time, he was returned to jail under heavier restraints. In the weeks before execution, Streeter's condition deteriorated. Reports indicated he attempted several strategies to avoid hanging, including feigning insanity and refusing food. By February 1864, he had become severely weakened. Witness accounts described a prisoner so frail he could barely stand, yet even at the end, Streeter maintained his innocence. Shortly before the execution, Mrs. Coy's father reportedly confronted him directly. Streeter answered, "As true as there is a God in heaven, I never murdered your daughter." The hanging itself became another public spectacle. More than 15,000 people gathered outside the execution grounds in Medina. Authorities erected a tall wooden fence around the gallows, but portions of the crowd tore it down and burned it. Guards prevented spectators from overrunning the execution site. Streeter was too weak to walk to the scaffold. Officers carried him to the gallows and seated him in a chair positioned above the trap. His final recorded words were, "The crime for which I am about to die, I am entirely innocent of. May God forgive those who have wronged me." Moments later, the trap opened. Frederick F. Streeter died on February 26, 1864. The Coy murders officially ended with his execution, but the case remained discussed in Ohio newspapers for years afterward. Part of that lingering fascination came from the nature of the evidence itself. The prosecution's case had been powerful, but largely circumstantial. The blood-stained bills, the sudden money, the flight west, and Streeter's familiarity with the household convinced the jury beyond reasonable doubt. Yet Streeter never confessed. That absence left a narrow space for continued debate. For the Coy family, however, the consequences were absolute. Shubal Coy, his wife, and their 7-year-old son Ferdinand were buried together after one of the most shocking crimes Medina County had ever experienced. The house where the murders occurred remained remembered locally for decades, preserved in postcards and newspaper sketches long after the Civil War had ended. And the case itself became part of a larger 19th century American pattern: crimes solved through movement, witness testimony, financial behaviour, and circumstantial reconstruction, long before modern forensic science existed. In Medina, the murders entered local history not as legend, but as record. A family destroyed for money, a drifter who claimed innocence to the end, and a community that never fully forgot the fire discovered before dawn on July 2, 1863.